Good morning, Chairman. We are now live.
Good morning, everyone. And it's very good to see everyone here today. So we'll commence as it's 10 o'clock. And if we could have apologies for absence, Tom, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. We have apologies from Councillors Coupland, King and Bunny.
Thank you. And declaration of interest, members. Any? No? No? We can say none there then, thank you. And we have the minutes of the Audit Committee last, which was on the 5th of February. Could I have a proposer and a seconder for those, if they're true and correct record? Thank you. Thank you. All those in favour? Thank you. Okay, and then we will go to item 4, which is a review of the Constitution, and we've got a report from Will. So I'll pass over to Will. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, members. Yeah, this report is my first report to the Audit Committee, recommending some changes to the Council's Constitution. The terms of reference of the Audit Committee require the committee to oversee the Council's Constitution. So with that in mind, I've produced this report for the committee to consider this morning. And it identifies a number of relatively minor and straightforward changes to the Constitution following a review that's been carried out with my colleagues in Democratic Services, particularly Nicola Carver to my left. Paragraph 1.2 of the report refers to the areas that have been identified that require amendment, and the consultation that's taken place hitherto with the various other bodies of the Council, including the Executive and Scrutiny panels, prior to this report being produced this morning. Appendix A provides a narrative and a rationale for the changes, which I will quickly take you through, Chair, if that's okay, and refers to the appendices at the back of the report showing the current provisions of the Constitution with the recommended changes in bold for ease of reference. So the first item for review is a substitution scheme. The Council's had a substitution scheme in the Constitution for a long period of time, and all we've sought to do is update the scheme to reflect long-standing custom and practice and ensure that that custom and practice is codified within the scheme, hopefully to ensure greater clarity on the nomination process to aid political groups. The second item is in relation to the Council's standards arrangements. Quite a detailed appendix, quite a few changes, but relatively straightforward changes comprising of 3 elements. The first is to expand the criteria against which complaints against members may be considered. At the moment, we have rather limited criteria, and I've sought to expand those criteria to give greater discretion and also to give greater clarity for complainants that are thinking of bringing a complaint. An example would be to impose a time limit by which complaints must be submitted, so we wouldn't accept a complaint over 6 months old. So that's the type of amendment that I've suggested. Also to ensure that when considering complaints that the Council's resources and whether it's in the public interest for a matter to be investigated is taken into account. So it's merely an expansion of the existing assessment criteria. I've also suggesting that we develop a model form of complaint that complainants must complete, hopefully to ensure that we capture all the information in one source document at the beginning of the process. At the moment, complaints can be triggered by a simple 2-line email without giving any detail as to the nature of the complaint, the incident that's relied upon, or indeed the paragraphs of the Code of Conduct that it's alleged to have been breached. So the purpose of the complaint, as I say, is a one-stop capture document so that we can have that information from the very off, which we can then provide to elected members for them to consider and respond to. And the final change is merely a tweak to the existing hearing process. Fortunately, we are an authority with a low level of complaints, and within that, not many end up before a hearings panel of the committee. But I have sought to just update the existing hearings process to bring it in line with the model hearings process that's recommended by the Local Government Association. So it's as I say, it's a little bit of housekeeping to ensure that the process, should it be required, is in keeping with the latest recommended best practice. The next is amendments to the health scrutiny terms of reference. This amendments are required following some regulations that came into being earlier this year, the Local Authority Public Health, Health and Wellbeing Boards and Health and Scrutiny Amendment and Savings Provision Regulations 2025. It trips off the tongue. And relatively straightforward amendments, as I say, prescribed by the instrument that in particular deal with the new call-in powers for the Secretary of State, who may issue directions to NHS bodies where they're commissioning a proposal that may involve a substantial variation in services. So the purpose of the amendment was to ensure that the Council's terms of reference keep pace with the changes in legislation following the enacting of that statutory instrument. The second is the Council's petition scheme. The Council's had a petition scheme for many years. Just a minor couple of changes just to add clarity in terms of the number of signatures required to commence a petition, and also to add clarity on the types of things that we would not want to entertain a petition regarding, such as planning applications and tree preservation orders and such like. So it's just adding clarity again to the process to make sure that those wishing to avail the scheme are clear on what the scheme's purpose is and its remit. The next is the gifts and hospitality thresholds. There's a current imbalance at the moment where members are required to declare any gifts and hospitality over £50. Officers have a threshold of £25, and all I'm seeking to do is harmonise the two so that we've got £50 across both spectrums. The next is the budget and policy framework. Just a minor couple of additions to the statutory element of the budget and policy framework by virtue of inclusion of the crime and disorder reduction strategy and the annual library plan. The next, the corporate parenting panel terms of reference, just changes again to recognise a change in a desire for the panel to approach things slightly differently, taking a more thematic approach to meetings and ensuring that the right people are in the room that may contribute to agendas based upon that thematic approach, with a view to promoting inclusion and ensuring better performance management of the business brought before the panel. And the final two is a tweak to the Council's key decision definition. Again, this is just an amendment to ensure that the definition reflects the current statutory provision and again codifies the long-standing custom and practice of the Council. So for operational purposes there is no change. The practice has always been to ensure that key decisions capture savings in excess of £500,000, and the purpose of this revision is just to ensure that the definition in the Constitution reflects that long-standing custom and practice. And finally, the Common Seal of the Council, I've just built in to the provisions concerning the affixing of the Common Seal the ability to affix an electronic seal, and that is to ensure that we keep pace with industry changes that are now increasingly relying on electronic signature software, so that I don't have to still issue the seal by way of wet copy. It can be done electronically. So they're the proposed changes, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's very helpful. Thank you. If I could have Andrew, Adam, Mark. Thank you.
This is about member standards and declaring interest. I'm an independent person in 2 district councils. What was the rationale for broadening the criteria? Were you having to capture a few horses after they'd bolted in the way that in my other place cyber got away from us before we reminded members that social media was a bit of a risky area? Is there any underlying concern, or you're being ultimately preventative, are you?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's the latter actually, and it's just having a nod to the best practice that's developed in this area over a number of years, particularly through the work done by the LGA. As I say, the existing provisions in the arrangements were fine, but I've merely sought to expand them really to give greater flexibility and discretion, not least so that complainants can see a little bit more into the basis on which complaints will be examined. So from the outset there's more clarity for their benefit. But also I think one of the grounds on which we quite bluntly had to refuse complaints was on the basis that it was the complaint was regarded as minor or trivial. Well, unfortunately for complainants, to tell them that their complaint is minor or trivial is not well received and doesn't land well. So with the expansion in the criteria, it gives me a little bit more subtlety within which to approach these matters, not least being able to consider the public interest and also the use of council's resources. So, as I say, hopefully a little bit more flexibility and discretion that suits both the authority but also complainants when embarking on this process.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. No, I mean, I've got no real question about this. I do certainly welcome this. I do think the Constitution was in a position where we did need to refresh it. And I believe that the changes that have been made and proposed here are very welcomed. I know from myself they are. So, no, really good work. So I really am pleased with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a very comprehensive set of changes to the far-ranging range of processes and committees. Does this actually bring us fully up to scratch in terms of the legal requirements or best practice requirements, or even comparing us to other local authorities? Or are we going to see a series of these? There may well be a series of these as we require to, but is there more to come that you know of?
In answer, yes, there is. What I'm seeking to do is put in place an internal review process that ensures that throughout the year we keep an eye on the Constitution to ensure that it continues to keep pace with changes in legislation and best practice. As it currently stands, it's perfectly compliant, so I can give you that reassurance. But as we move through the year, what I intend to do, as I say, is carry out a systematic review across services in terms of the various policies and protocols, just to ensure that we do keep pace. And I would anticipate bringing regular reports to this committee, as I say, to ensure that the committee discharges its responsibility to oversee the Constitution. It's a bit like the Forth Bridge in a sense. The Constitution, you never finish painting it, you never finish reviewing it. As we see, legislation changes all the time. Full Council is the parent body into the Constitution in terms of having to approve any changes, so we'll have to work through and around the calendar of Full Council meetings, but I would anticipate, as I say, coming to this committee with any recommendations for changes for the committee to consider and make its recommendations to the council. But it's a piece of work that will be ongoing, and as I say, just really to ensure that we do keep pace with changes legislation and best practice as it continues to evolve.
With your acceptance, Will, has the trawl sort of identified any significant risks, if that's the right terminology, or is it possible that some may be hidden away somewhere?
No, there's nothing there that is of concern to me at all. I mean, the Constitution does reflect the culture and the political dynamics of each council. There is a modular constitution that was brought in 2000. It's such a long period of time, but by and large, the council's constitution, in terms of the review that I've carried out hitherto, stands up very, very well to other council constitutions. So I'm give assurance that it's a sound, legally compliant document, but I just want to ensure that we keep tabs on it, as I say, as legislation develops and guidance is issued, so that it keeps pace with that, and that it's a regular update rather than an annual update, which I think has been generally tends to be the custom and practice in most councils, that they bring an update to the annual meeting. But I would like to ensure that we do that throughout the year wherever possible, subject to changes arising.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Mark. Ian.
Thank you, Chair. Just on the complaints process, having been on the receiving end of two badly implemented complaints process enhancements, I think was the words they used. When you, and I'm sure you guys will have this covered off, when you move into it, you want to capture more data up front situation, you end up unintentionally making it so hard to complain, you actually start getting more complaints about the complaints process. than you do the actual complaints coming through with any valid. So it's that balance for me that says, given, I absolutely agree, it can't be just a 2-line entry, but at the same time making sure we don't go to the other extreme. And you've got to complete a form online, and you've got to one of these select drop-down boxes, and none of them actually apply to what I'm trying to do. So just making sure there is that checks and balances in the dial move to make sure we get this right, and not to be afraid to go again a second time if we still think we can still do a bit tighter. Could you just give us a bit of assurance on that one? Thank you.
Yeah, I think, as I say, I wanted to avoid, in my short time here, I think the current process, I thought, did require a slight tweak, as I say, to probably instill a little bit more sort of discipline in the process, so that, as I say, we move away from the 2-line email that can trigger a process, but also, I think, by ensuring that complainants do complete a form, it's got to be proportionate. I certainly don't want to create an industry. I certainly don't want to put in place a process that puts people off. And my intention is to, should the committee and council approve, would be to put the complaint form on a more sort of prominent part of the council's website, because at the moment what I'm tending to find is the complaints are being a little bit confused because they're coming through the council's corporate complaints process. So when members of the public are looking to complain against councillors, the process is not entirely clear in terms of the mapping that needs to be taking place. So I think it's proportionate, as you say, in my mind's eye. I don't want to create an industry. I don't want this to act as a deterrent, but at the same time, in fairness to members, I think they're entitled to know from the outset the information that's being prayed against them, so they can make a case in terms of defending that. And I think at the moment, by not having a sort of a codified process, what should be relatively straightforward tends to lead to a to-ing and froing of emails to complainants to say, well, thanks for your email, but you now need to give me a little bit more information before I can proceed with the complaint, because members, under natural justice rules, are entitled to know the case against them that can meet it. So I think by providing that in a one-stop capture form should, as I say, hopefully make the process a little bit more lean, and ensure that, you know, the parties to the process are understanding of the issues that they have to face from day one.
Well, if I can offer an idea, I think West Lindsey District Council's got that balance about right. So I'm sure Lisa Langdon would be happy to hear from you.
Yes, I've worked many years with Lisa, so I will have that conversation with her when I next see her, but that's helpful. Thank you for that.
Thank you both. Just one point, Will. I was looking at the, obviously, on the training issues on the standing committees. Obviously, I think it is important that we have that. We haven't changed the requirement that people have to renew the training, even if they've been existing councillors. I think, as you said, the regulations change on a fairly regular basis, and just general things happening across the board as well. Mark and I think have had a board conversation with Claire about the financial training for incoming members after the next election, because we think that's quite pertinent. I think it's pretty dry subject. Don't get a lot of volunteers to do that one, but it is absolutely key, as is obviously the pension committee training as well, and that it changes even more than the financial regulation. So yeah, I think that's very important. Thank you. So we have the recommendation that we approve we consider the contents of the report and endorse the proposals, details, and recommend the same to full council. So do I have a proposer and a seconder? Thank you. All those in favour? Thank you. Thank you. So that is carried. So if we can then move on and to item 5, which is the external audit plans, and we have our colleagues here from Marshmallow and his colleague from KPMG, and I will hand over to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm going to open this presentation on the. Sorry, you would notice there's two reports here. We'll take the first report first, and then opportunity to ask questions, and then move on to the pensions report. I'll open this presentation for this item and then pass to my colleague Sophie, who will take you through some of the significant risks. Firstly, I'm really pleased to bring this report here because it's the first of our reports under the current round of external audit appointments by PSAA. This report helps discharge our responsibilities under the NAO Code of Audit Practice and legislation and various bits of auditing standards in terms of reporting to those charged with governance. The report says draft. This report will remain draft because firstly we need to complete our handover process with the outgoing auditors Mazars. That will be completed later this week. And also, there's a number of consultations in the sector, one from the NAO, one from the Department for Levelling Up Communities and Housing, and one from CITFA, which will have an impact on the accounts and audit regs, the Code of Audit Practice, and specific aspects of accounting potentially. So we need to see the outcome of those before finalising our plan. So we may need to revisit this plan, but from the various discussions I've had with officers and understandings of where those consultations are going, I think those will be on the edges of this plan. The plan comes at the end of our planning and risk assessment for work, where we've considered areas such as your control environment, understanding your core business processes, and the various systems that ultimately lead to the numbers which you see in your financial system and financial accounts, as well as understanding your performance to date. One of the initial decisions that we make is over on page 71 of the pack, or page 3 of the document, and that concerns materiality. What we don't do is we don't audit every single penny. You know, we'd be here a very long time, and I think your fee would be considerably higher if we had to audit every single penny. What we do is we set a materiality. That materiality we determined as £25 million, which is broadly 2% of your expenditure. So that's well within the range which we're allowed to go up to. We then don't just look for issues in and around that materiality level. We actually design our procedures at a lower level to look for individual errors that could add up and lead to a material misstatement. And of course, we'll report areas at a lower level to you if and when we identify those as part of our audit. Once we've set our materiality, we think about what are the significant risk areas, what are the key concerns that could lead to a material misstatement. And over on page 73 of the pack, page 5 of the document, we've at a high level identified those significant risks and those other audit risks. I'm going to allow my colleague Sophie to just briefly take you through each of those risks.
Thanks, Rash. So if you move to page 74 of the pack, you can see our first risk is over the valuation of land and buildings. We identify this as a significant risk because of the huge amount of assumptions that go into the valuation of your land and building portfolio, and any small change could have a material impact on that valuation. To combat this risk, essentially, we'll use our valuation specialists to help us assist in understanding whether those assumptions are appropriate, and we'll also look at the underlying data that goes into that valuation to understand whether that has been used appropriately. Moving on to our second risk is around the valuation of investment properties held by the council. So again, in a very similar vein, there are a huge amount of assumptions that go into the valuation of your investment property portfolio. So a change in those assumptions can have a material impact. Again, very similarly, we'll be using our valuation specialists to conduct a review of those assumptions and ensure that they're appropriate for that portfolio. And again, we'll be looking at the underlying data used in that valuation. On page 76 of the pack, you'll see we've identified a risk of management override of controls, and that's absolutely not unusual for an audit. I think in any audit you would see management override of controls as a significant risk, and that is because management are in a unique position to fraudulently manipulate accounting records. In order to combat this risk again, we will look at any estimates, which I've touched on briefly for the valuation of land and buildings, but we'll ensure that those estimates are appropriate and the judgments used are again appropriate for the council. We also look at journal entries made by management to ensure that they are appropriate and not indicative of fraudulent recognition. And we'll look at combinations within your ledger to make sure that they actually are appropriate. And we will be using KPMG automated audit procedures to do that. Moving on to the next page, we've identified a risk over the valuation of post-retirement benefit obligations, specifically around the local government pension scheme. The reason for this, in a very similar vein to the valuation of land and buildings, is that there are a huge amount of assumptions that go into the valuation of post-retirement benefits, and any small change could have a hugely material impact on that valuation. We will be using our KPMG Pension Centre of Excellence to help us address this risk, and they will be looking at the valuation, obligations to understand that the assumptions that have gone into calculating that are appropriate, and they'll also look at the underlying data that supports that, such as membership data and cash flow data. We have noted in our plan that we have seen that some local authorities are recognising surpluses in their local government pension scheme. So where that is the case, we will design procedures to ensure that that surplus has been recognised appropriately. As we go through the pack from pages 78 and 79, we've identified areas where we haven't identified a significant risk. So if we talk through expenditure, the rationale for this is that the council is in a strong financial position, so we actually don't consider there to be an incentive to manipulate that expenditure fraudulently to meet your required position. Similarly, over revenue, again, we've not identified a significant risk over your various revenue streams, again, because the council is in a strong financial position, but equally because the income that is recognised is relatively simple in nature, so we haven't identified a significant risk there. The last 2 pages that I'll take you through in the pack are over our other audit risks. So on page 80, we identified a risk over revenue expenditure being inappropriately recognised as capital expenditure. So you can see that the capital expenditure, the capital programme of the council is highly material to us. So what we want to ensure is that expenditure which shouldn't be capitalised isn't being capitalised. And we'll do that by identifying any controls to ensure that capital expenditure is appropriately recognised or moved into revenue expenditure where required. And then we'll do some sample testing to ensure that that has been captured appropriately. And the final slide that I'll take you through before I pass back to Rash is regarding the ledger migration. So at the start of this financial year, the council moved to a newer version of BW to record their accounting entries. We've identified a risk here that the balances from the old system haven't migrated appropriately into the new system. So we'll essentially be designing procedures to make sure that those balances have been moved appropriately. We'll be engaging our IT specialists to understand the governance procedures and the controls that have allowed the council to move those accounting entries over appropriately. And then we'll be doing specific item testing to ensure that on an account by account basis, those values have been moved over appropriately. I'll now pass you back to Rash to talk through the rest of our report.
If we can turn to page 85 in the pack, that page talks about our approach to value for money. So our audit is not just concerned with the financial statements, it's also concerned with value for money and your arrangements for securing value for money. As your previous auditors, we're required to provide a commentary on your arrangements, and we will do that. As part of that process, we undertake a risk assessment to review your arrangements. So we look at your financial arrangements, your risk management arrangements such as partnership working. We identify potential significant risks and significant weaknesses which we're required to report on. At this moment in time, we've not identified any significant risks or any significant weaknesses. Our risk assessment is ongoing and we'll report back at a further audit committee and then in your commentary of arrangements. In terms of the remainder of the document is mainly appendices. Page 89 provides your team details. Page 90 provides the kind of the cycle of our audit approach. So we're completing our planning and risk assessment work now. We'll be undertaking our interim field work shortly, where we're looking at the actual controls and testing the controls, the key controls. And then into July, we'll be starting our work on your financial statements, which you have a statutory duty to produce by the 31st of May. Over on page 91 are our fees. Our fees are set by PSA and follow the fees consultation which they had with yourselves and other local authorities late last year. And finally, we confirm our independence on page 92 and 93. Required to be independent, something we can confirm here. There's no non-audit services to report to you as of today. And there's no other relationships we need to raise that would have an impact on our independence. Through you, Chairman, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mark and Sophie. Thank you. Adam, Mark.
Thank you, Chairman. So yeah, I mean, I will start with the fees. I think the increase is just disproportionate. If in my business and accounting, if we increased hours by that much, we'd have no clients left. So I don't agree that they should have gone up so much. It was mentioned that you were going to use a valuation specialist. Is that extra cost as well? Is that within that fee basis? I was also extremely concerned. Well, actually, not concerned. I was just thought the words were a bit sloppy, actually, with regards to management can manipulate figures and be fraudulent. I mean, I heard that a couple of times. I don't know whether that's what you meant or whether it was just to raise or highlight the fact that that could happen. But it was I thought it was very sloppily put. So if that could be clarified, please.
Through you, Chairman. So in terms of the fees, there was a procurement process undertaken by PSA, firms fed into that. The cost, we're in unprecedented times where we've seen within the sector the delays and the backlog that's been developed. The expectation of auditors has risen, and the PSA has set fees based on the tender process that they put in place, and you as an organisation was consulted on. But ultimately, the driver is the expectations of audit, the number of auditing standards we need to comply with, and the procurement process produce those fees. They're not set by us; they're actually set by PSA.
Can I just come back in on that, please? No, I understand they are set by PSAA. However, I do think it's because there's a lack of auditors and a lack of companies that now provide external audit. There is now 5 or 6 big companies that do this, and that means that they have a monopoly, basically, which means that they can go to PSSA and say that we haven't got the auditors anymore. We need to get more in. We need to increase fees. I think it came more from the audit side than the local government side.
I think just picking up on what you've said, though, Adam, there was a reduction prior to the previous year, so they did go down substantially. So I don't quite know where that leaves us in terms of the increase across the board, but that they definitely went down quite dramatically. And I think that they have gone up dramatically as well. Indeed, they have. Yeah. So just put a little bit in context. Thank you, Adam. Mark, and then.
Well, it's similar sort of comments to Councillor Stoke that's already made. I would like maybe an officer input as well. The way the tender goes is a sort of fixed item, for doing the well-trodden path work that we do year in, year out. And that is, tendered, and so presumably we get some degree of value for money. That may be the wrong expression, but at least it's tendered, so there is some justification in terms of what those fixed prices are. It seems to be the extra over costs that are a little bit worrying, because we frequently get additional requests from government, as well as from the SIPCA, I think it is, in terms of doing extra things, and some of those extra things are quite difficult to do. and require an awful lot of time and effort to actually come forward with some sort of figure. I'm sure those are covered in the contract that's been agreed, and there may well be processes, that are in line with the PSAA requirements. But what are those? What worries me is, are they simply time and rates in terms of the extra work? Or are they fixed items so that we understand what they are? And if they are simply time and rates, who then assesses whether we're getting value for money from them from the time and rates calculations? Because it does seem as though, unless somebody's looking at those and saying that seems to be about right in terms of time and rates, we don't have little control over these extra costs that are being put forward. And as Councillor Stokes said, the fees are going up, and partly you can understand why that is the case, and we have to, just bear the pressures of the marketplace, I suppose, to a certain extent. But it doesn't mean to say that we can't ensure that we are getting good value and money from these big firms. So maybe an officer comment might be useful.
So if I can just make a comment first, thank you, Councillor, for those comments. I think a bit of context might be helpful. We've actually got the finalised audit fees paper in the next paper, actually on page 157, that might provide you some context, and you can see there where the additional costs have come through when we've worked with Mazars. I think what's fair to say is that the last process that was run by PSAA, the work that was required of the auditors at the time those bids were put forward and those prices were set was very different to what was actually asked of the auditors at that time, and is predominantly the reason why we've got into the position we have with the audit, the whole audit kind of scenario that we've got. The latest round of tender process by PSAA is probably a better reflection of the work that's required of the auditors and the level of depth they have to go in, particularly into the areas of risk that Sophie mentioned around our balance sheet. So I think in terms of the overall core work, there's less risk to us in terms of the additional requirements. I think quite a lot of that's been taken out. Rash can probably comment on the areas where they feel that they might need to expand beyond that core role if that's required. You can see from that paper on the next paper, page 157, where Mazars had to go beyond that which basically wasn't captured in the core contract, and I think most of that is now captured in there, but Rash can probably expand on that a little bit.
Sorry, Chairman, can I come back? The issue was how that additional work is being valued, and is that simply time and rates, or is there some sort of fixed cost associated with doing the additional work, or is it a percentage increase on the contract price? And if it is simply time and rates, who signs it off? Does PSAA sign it off, or do we sign it off?
Yeah, so a couple of things there in terms of. Michelle's correct in terms of number of those areas. Those are now inbuilt into the contract, so they take into account the additional requirements. In terms of if there's anything over and above that scale fee, I'm required to come to the authority and ask them to say, for example, the ledger migration. That's something that doesn't happen every single year. It cannot be predicted in a scale fee. I would come to the authority after undertaking that work and saying, it's taken this amount of time. This is the rate which is in the contract, times the two together. That's the fee that I will be submitting to PSA for approval. Do you have any comments on that? So it is a time and rates. The rate has been agreed as part of the procurement process, and the hours are what we will have a discussion about. And of course, I always liaise with officers to make the process as easy as possible, so we charge in the lowest possible fee.
Thank you, Rash. Actually, I was going to ask you that question about the migration of the data test, so that was great to clear us up. Thank you. There's just, I think there was one point, Adam's second point.
Yes, Chairman, there was a
if
couple
you
of
come back to Adam on that, because I think I do apologise, Adam, I skipped over that and went to Mark's question regarding the fee.
So yeah, it was to do with the evaluation and also the wording with regards to manipulating figures.
We'll relook at that wording, but the wording is from the standard in terms of that's the risk that we need to be aware of. So we're not absolutely, what we're not saying is that we found that risk here, but we have to stand back and be aware of that particular risk, and then design our processes appropriately to detect such issues. So absolutely. So if that's, we'll relook at that wording to make sure it's very clear that we've not found any specific factors at the authority. And I also know, I've got noted here, is I know you mentioned a question about use of specialists, and that is, that's included in that. We've not identified anything from our risk assessment work that would need us to go out to further different specialists that we hadn't expected, and not, that's not included in that fee.
Thank you. So as the second accountant on the panel, question for you on this is, it's really easy to get overwhelmed by what is effectively comparing two big numbers. My question, having done this many times with my auditors, is it's less about the total number, it's about the hours assumed behind that, and how this compares to why you think certain hours compared to predecessors have done various things, because there's also the getting up to speed, the investment costs, which most firms usually bury themselves, and then there's the recovery percentage. So again, when we look at this one, again, in the past, I know we got a good deal. Let's be completely honest, we got a good deal in the previous, in terms of recovery percentages. What we don't want to do is to go to a very stark, to take Councillor Allen's point as well, is you're suddenly recovering 80% on a fee price of every hour, because that's extraordinary. And I think that's the bit that I don't think we have the information on at this moment in time. I don't know what level of visibility as a committee, council, we will get that says actually the hourly rates that we're talking to sign up to compared to what we had, the assumption about the hours and the recovery percentage, because that's, for me, as a man who has an audit fee that's 4 times the size of this, that's how I batter my auditors, and that's part of my sport as well, but that's just fun for me. But that's what I really want to understand.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So the fees are based on, basically you have a scale fee that's set by PSA. So we do have a model behind that, but our model is based on a range of different variables that takes into a range of factors. But that's a commercial decision between us and PSA. So you would need to go to PSA to speak to them about how they actually set the scale fee based on the procurement information. Because I don't actually have a contract with yourselves. The contract
I understand
with PSA.
that. I think the question behind is the visibility and clarity. That is, and please don't take this personally because it's not, that's a lot of obfuscation behind my contracts over here and over here. What I'm trying to look at is the case of saying, is this a delivery of service that we're paying for? So yes, I agree we're paying with the PSAA, but that's what I want to understand. That's my assurance that says actually the level of activity that you believe on a professional basis you require to discharge. As we've also mentioned as well from my colleague over here, the fact is we've got, and later in the paper, we've got some SIPFA recommendations that still haven't landed potentially. They're going to be given guidance. I'm looking more of this side now. So the fact is this is a base price for something. There may well be other things on top. We've talked about the mechanism, but actually not comparing like with like. The step up that went through the audit fees last year included additional requirements. Understand that. That happens all the time. But that's the bit for me is I get one number on the next paper that is the total fee. There is no breakdown. There is no, and again is coming here. That's what I need to see. I don't care who provides it. That's what for me would like to understand, because that actually tells me more confidence about whether it's a rate increase, a volume increase, a mix increase. I don't know, and I can't see it from this. So could I put a request in if that's okay? I don't mind who provides it, but I'd like to see an understanding, a lot better position from the committee, because you're not going to get as much pushback, although you'll get quite a lot of pushback from us, on that basis, because we're blind, we've just got two big numbers. So could I just request however channels that through, please?
So we'll work with officers to bring you back something that was part of the consultation process, because there was some detail included in that. And then in terms of your question about scale and volume, and there's potentially some changes into the future, PSA set a new scale fee each year. So in terms of the consultation for the scale fees for 24-25, they will take into account changes in terms of the NAO code, changes in terms of accounts and audit regulations, and potentially changes into the SIPFA code of accounting practice, which you have to comply with in terms of producing accounts as well.
Yeah, I bet you weren't looking forward to having this chat about fees. But in the context of a 5% council tax increase, more than 100% increase in fees, you'd expect us to challenge on grounds of value for money. And of course, you're not sole agent in this, you're subordinate to PSAA. And they will have made assumptions that need to go into a standard framework charge that will reflect Birmingham, Croydon, Nottingham, and a few other places. This is not one of those authorities. We've heard from your colleague, you're not high risk there, you're not risky there, we don't have speculative investments. We have an impeccable financial management and probity record. In fact, who is sorting out Nottingham and Northampton? It's former colleagues of these people here. So the question is there a point at which we say we don't procure through PSAA, we go to the market on our own, and the low risk nature of Lincolnshire will command a much lower fee than PSAA will land upon us?
Thank you, Andrew. I think there are some issues with that, but I'll hand over to Michelle and she'll give me the definitive reason why we probably can't.
Yeah, so I think my first response to the last bit is I think we'd be lucky to get an auditor if we went on our own, to be quite honest. And I think that's the risk that you provide. PSAA provide the external audit for, I think, is that 98% of local authorities. This will reflect that some authorities are more risky than others, absolutely. So it's not like an insurance fund, but you pay a fixed rate based on the total risk of the whole pot. The risk of us coming out of that arrangement is that you won't get an auditor at all, or it will cost very much more because you're not being considered as part of a big whole of audit facility and audit functions. So I do imagine KPMG probably won't need to do as much probity as they might do in other authorities for us. The price reflects their total amount of work.
Well, I think we have to accept that there are, we require the services of a large organisation to be able to deal with the audit risks that potentially, I say potentially, are out there. So I think we've got to sort of, although we may not like the situation on the ground, I mean, I think, it's coming back to the reality of what the market can offer us effectively. But as Ian said, we do have to challenge that charge out rate as well. And I'll go to Ian in a moment, Michelle, but I think there's one topic that we didn't pick up from what Ian raised, which was the recovery rate, particularly for additional work. Because if we're getting, I don't know, looking at most... I mean, obviously that's going to hopefully be a process of negotiation rather than sort of putting an item down on the timesheet and absolutely every minute being recoverable, because accounting practice, my point of view, doesn't work like that. It didn't ought to, otherwise you won't have any clients left for very long.
I think from what we've said, that some of the risks of the extra work that was picked up during the last couple of years has all been built into the scale fee, the core scale fee. Any additional work that's undertaken by KPMG, they'll go back to PSAA with that. There'll be fixed charges around that, and we have to agree them before they get paid. The reason the Mazars paper is in here is because it had to go through that process before we agreed their final fees. Clearly a long time after their work had completed. I think the other thing to mention is it was quite well documented and publicised that there was an expectation of an increase of 150% around these fees before that work was even undertaken with PSAA. So this was well expected, and it's across the board. So it's not just us. It's what we expected, and it was well publicised before PSAA undertook that work. Yeah.
Ian.
It's not often I'm the least gravelly person, and I think it's just not a testification. I think this is why I'm kind of looking at the risk and the hours. okay, because the rate, I think from taking a little bit of the emotion out of the conversation, we know relatively how good we are compared to a lot of places. We see other areas that are having big issues. The rates will have been agreed on a spread basis. So do you know what? We are probably subsidising people who aren't as good as we are. Forgive the modesty, but we are probably subsidising this. Just have a look at the EU funding model. I'll just throw that grenade in and walk away as well. But fundamentally for me, this is where I want to understand the activity base rather than the rate base, because the activity base is the one thing that we should be able to control. Because again, there's a lot of assumptions about we get papers on time and everything else, and puts pressures onto the executive and the teams doing it as well. Again, when I want to see the hours and the recovery is because the answer is actually if we over-deliver, rather than just a case of you just have to deliver on time, and actually we do a really good job, there's lots of pressures around overruns. So that's why I'm personally, I say, from the rates, I know we're going to be overcompensating for others. That's just going to be the case. I know the price in the market, I know that's the case. However, there's nothing to say that we shouldn't challenge back on that activity, and that's kind of say why I'm harping on about that.
As Rash just said, we'll have a look to see if we can bring something back to help outline some of that stuff.
Forward to him in a little bit more detail on that, perhaps at a later stage. Michelle, thank you. Michelle, thank you. Vash. Any further questions from anybody else before I pitch in? No, that's okay. Thank you. Okay, just a couple of things from myself. You've noted on page 76, Rash and Sophie, about the journals and the authorisation and segregation of duties on, well, not the authorisation, but segregation of duties on journals. Could you just expand that a little bit, please? And also on, I was looking at some notes, so I do apologise. And the ledger migration, I think we've touched on that regarding the additional work that may be required. But historically, and I'm looking at Michelle here, do we retain the historic data is migrated as well, is it or not? And if so, what are the controls on that? And then I was just looking at a general point, and then this is probably looking at Claire here, pulling this back to what we said about handover training after the next election. Because I think this is a very good case in point, a good starting point to show members what we need to look at and why we need to look at it from an external basis, obviously, and then our team can cover the internal one. I think the issues raised here are quite straightforward, and you can see what bars would be having to reach, basically. Thank you.
So just on the management override of controls, that's always been a risk that's been set out in our external auditors' plans. Mazars had that in there. That's always been a key risk that they've looked at. I think the KPMG plan obviously picks up particularly on journals. I think I can assure you that if I'm having to do journals, then we're in a very bad place, to be quite honest. I do have access to the system to do journals, but I'm not sure I would remember how to. Andrew definitely doesn't have access to do journals. And generally I would expect that, and Rash and Sophie kind of set this out in their kind of preamble, that if you are struggling financially, it could be something that you could do to try and manipulate. You can't generate extra cash through journals, you can't generate extra revenue, but you can manipulate the position and the picture that you're selling. In terms of our legacy system, all of the controls and balances were the migration of the data from the legacy system to the new system was very controlled, and we've got all the records of how that's migrated and how that was reconciled. And I know Sue's spoken to the IT specialist with KPMG already to start discussing that. We have a database of all the data from the legacy system. We are about to start decommissioning our old system. So from 1st of April, we're out of support and out of security effectively with the old system, so that's going to start to be decommissioned. So we're hoping to be able to get off what KPMG need before then, but we have got all the data sat behind that anyway in a legacy database.
It's a supplementary point which I was going a little bit off the point, but should we need to retrieve that historic data, we're still going to be able to do so. That's what I'm concerned.
The data's all there. It's how easily it is to extract, because the system's not there with all of the reporting that we would have had in our legacy system. So we would have had a number of reports set up to easily extract data. If we've got to extract data from our database, we'd have to write reports and things to do that. So not as quickly, but it's all there.
We just need to be clear about that might be involve more work. Should we need to do that at a later date? That's great, thank you. And yep, that's good. And I was just going to, I think that's great. Thank you very much for those replies. Thank you, everyone. And we have then we'll move on to the pension fund. If that's okay.
Thank you, Chairman. So the pension fund, we provided an indicative plan here. It went to Pensions Committee and Pensions Board last week. For similar reasons, this is quite a high-level plan. It doesn't go into the detail because of the open consultations and us completing our handover process with the outgoing auditor, which is later this week. We have provided our indicative assessment of materiality. The typical areas of risk we're exploring and would then feature as part of an final audit plan. What you'll see there is some very similarities. Management override of controls. It's a standard and assumed risk under auditing standards. Hence it's there. We've got general ledger migration over on page 103 as well, because you've undertaken a general ledger change, and clearly a lot of work around the investments in the pension fund. We mention contributions because that's akin to revenue recognition, but again we rebut that risk because of the nature of the contributions, and we don't believe a fraud risk. There's a fraud risk in that, and we take some work clearly around levels of cash within the pension fund as well. We've, on page 104, talked about our fees again. So those fees are set in exactly the same process by PSA, and have seen a similar increase in total audit fees. But again, the same arrangements in terms of if there's variations to those, that would follow the same arrangement as well. As for the authority, we're also required to confirm our independence from a pension fund perspective, which we have done on page 105 and 106 of the document. And through you, Chairman, more than happy to take any questions.
Questions to Rash regarding the pension fund plan? Mark, I think
It's to do with both reports anyway. Are we likely to be able to deliver the auditor reports for both the county and pensions by the due date? Are there anything that's been thrown into the mix that's going to cause problems this year?
So, through you, Chairman, from our perspective, we're working to a plan to, issue our audit opinions by the autumn. So, but clearly there's a consultation open around the accounts and audit regs, which may change that deadline. But we're currently working on the basis that by the end of September, we would like to have signed off for both the county council and the pension fund.
And you're fully resourced at KPMG to do that?
We are. The tender process that we went through PSA meant you couldn't win more than you wanted to or intended to, and we made sure the resources were available to deliver the work that we were aiming to win through that tender process. So those resources are available within the firm.
Do we have any further questions from Rash or Sophie? Thank you. Well, we have the recommendation before us. So could I have that proposed and seconded? Thank you. All those in favour? Thank you. Okay. So thank you to Rash and Sophie for those reports. Thank you. So if we can move on to item 6, which are our accounting policies regarding the statement of accounts. I'll pass over to Sue Maker.
Thank you, Chairman. This report brings together several aspects of our accounts and the audit process. Some of it is for information and therefore for noting, but we've also got our latest accounting policies, both for the main accounts and for the pension fund accounts, and those are for approval. So in the report, we talk about changes to the accounting code of practice, and the main things are the introduction of IFRS 16 leases. So members will probably remember that this was going to be introduced a few years ago, and SITFA deferred it, but now it's going to be implemented from April 2024. So that's in the standard as something that we're going to have to do. And also confirmation that the temporary solution for infrastructure assets that you'll remember we implemented in the previous year, that continues. So SITFA are looking for a longer term solution, but in the meantime, we'll continue to do what we did before for infrastructure assets. There are some other minor changes which don't have a significant impact on us. And then in terms of the accounts and audit regulations, subject to consultation, we're expecting the deadline for preparing draft accounts to be end of May. And then, as Rash has said, for publishing the audited accounts 30th of September. So we're planning to present our draft unaudited accounts to this committee on the 17th of June, together with a training session for members. In terms of our accounting policies, there are no changes to these compared to the accounting policies that were in the final version of the 22-23 accounts. In terms of the leasing standard, because that's being implemented from April 2024, we'll be changing our accounting policies in that year's accounts. So although there will be some differences in this year's accounts because of the leasing standards, we're still operating under the previous policy. SITFA's recently consulted on some short-term measures in the Code of Practice to help authorities in terms of the recovery of the current situation with the backlogs on auditing accounts. And we've included the timeline for that reset, recovery and reform, and that's in Appendix C on page 155. Some of the items in there are medium to longer term, but some of them are the shorter term. So one of the issues is the backstop dates for auditing and publishing audited accounts for those authorities that haven't had their 22-23 accounts signed off, and in some cases earlier years as well. That doesn't apply to us because, as you know, we did have our 22-23 accounts signed off. So that's fortunate. And then the other main issue is this current consultation on the short-term measures. The consultation deadline is the end of this week, and we'll be making a response to that consultation. But we're not anticipating that's going to make a significant difference to our process for closing the accounts. As Michelle mentioned earlier, in Appendix D on page 157, we've included the final figures for Mazars fees as well. So that wraps up the whole kind of Mazars contract with that information for you. So they're the main points. It's just approval of the accounting policies. We still may change those as we go through the accounts process if we come across things. But at the minute, they're the accounting policies that we're going to be running with for the closure of accounts. Happy to answer any questions on this.
Thank you, Sue. Looking at members for comments. No, Sue. Yes, Sue. Just picking up on what we said about that. Obviously, when we look at the draft accounts that will go to members of the audit committee at our June the 17th meeting, we're going to have the training beforehand. I think speaking when we had a briefing earlier, Michelle and Clay, you did say we'll probably do that training in-house prior to the meeting, as Ian Fifield, who usually comes and delivers it, couldn't be available on that particular day. Just let everybody know.
Yeah,
I think it'll be fine. I think we've probably Michelle or Sue or whatever will deliver us that.
I think Michelle's going to deliver the training and I'll present the accounts.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you. Thank you. Just to clarify. So other than that, I think Sue, we're quite happy with those members. So we have the recommendations before us. Do I have a proposer and seconder? Seconder, please. All those in favour? Thank you. Okay. So if we then move on to item 7, which is the risk-based risk management annual report, and I'll pass over to Claire, please.
It's actually Kevin today. Sorry,
it's me today.
Kevin's doing it.
Sorry. Thank you. Hopefully everyone's had time to read the report. This one, you'll spot this one slightly different to our usual progress report in that it's an annual report. It gives a bit of an overview of the work we've completed within the year in services and directorates. all of which links into our risk management strategy and which fed into the combined risk report that you received in February. So that overview's in there. The bulk of the report is the strategic risk register review for this quarter. We've done a couple of different things this time in that we've implemented the new risk matrix, as we said during our last review. That's removed the negligible impact on the risk matrix, which we've never really used previously. Strategic risks don't tend to have negligible impacts, which has allowed a rescore of all of the risks. So you'll probably have spotted a couple may have dropped down. We've also implemented the new assurance statements as well, which fits in with Audit's new assurance statements. That removes the high assurance, bumps up substantial and adds in adequate across the centre, which again, a lot of risk owners have made use of this time, and I think provides a slightly more accurate risk review in my eyes. The main areas I'd like to draw your attention to are the market supply risk. It now features children's market supply also, looking at the high needs education section and the social care side. That was highlighted during the review, the previous review, and then added mid-review, and is featured in this one. So, slightly difficult review this time in that we had an adequate assurance on the adult side, but we had a limited assurance on the children's, which has left us with limited assurance on that market supply risk overall, which I think is quite realistic at this point in time. But adults, nice to see the adequate in adults, I think. We also added mid-review, as discussed at combined risk, the LFR Command and Control Centre risk, which highlights the change across over from one system to a new system. The procurement was successful, which I think Mark mentioned during combined risk again, and we've moved into the implementation phase now. And we've added a new risk, which is the extreme weather events risk. The wording for that now is failure to action appropriate adaptation and mitigation strategies to ensure capacity and resilience from the increased occurrence and magnitude of extreme weather events to our service delivery, asset management and community expectations leading to resource pressures and reputational damage. Again, quite a mouthful, but what we've focused on this time is making sure we have a really strong wording so that you can fully understand the risk properly. And we've used a couple of terminology points that are industry standard in the climate change arena. We've also had a couple of changes in the strategic risk register as a whole. So the Serco contract risk, which obviously been on there for some time now, has been removed this round. As you're probably aware, a lot of it is merged back into LCC. Most of that's ongoing now, and there are risks sat at directorate and service level to represent the risks associated with those changes. And we have removed the inflation risk from the strategic risk register, and that it is now it's significantly lower, but there will be inflation risks featuring at director and service level, which essentially we've de-escalated that one. Are there any questions at all?
I'm pleased to read in the report that every service area now has got a risk register. That's a good start. And they presumably, each service department owns its own risk register. Who owns the council's strategic risk register?
CLT own that risk register. So the risk owners are all CLT members.
So could you explain that? What do you mean by CLT? Sorry.
Oh, sorry, corporate leadership team. So the exec directors and
It's the exec directors, is it? So the strategic risk register is reported to the executive board on a regular basis, is it?
To the corporate leadership team, yep, it's reported just before it comes here.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
Andrew.
How do you mitigate against increasing extreme weather events? Pray?
It's a really good question, and I know there are people working really hard at the minute to come up with controls for that risk. So they have a number, obviously, of controls in place at the minute, focused on the recent extreme weather events, and obviously looking at adaptation to prepare.
It's not completely facetious, because
it's a difficult one.
You could flood protect half the county, and you need to stop the coast being somewhere near Sleaford. But we can't afford to do all that, can we? So how do you decide which are the ones that are absolutely essential and affordable without making us bankrupt?
luckily we're not the risk owners, Andrew. So Andrew will be probably better placed to respond on that for us.
Yeah, I'll come in. So obviously this isn't an all-encompassing answer because there's a lot of work going on, as Kevin says at the moment. So members agreed during the most recent budget process to significantly increase investment in flooding, when we're currently working through the impacts of that at the moment. So that is around, you know, risk-based approach to working out where we can get the best impactful investment to reduce the impact of flooding events, albeit noting that whilst we are the lead local flood authority in statute, a lot of the power and ability to make major impacts rests with other bodies, and that's working in partnership with clearly the Environment Agency and the local internal drainage boards. So that's just on flooding. I think what this risk is about, though, is about broader impacts on our ability to deliver services that we're responsible for directly. So whether that's caring for the vulnerable in extreme heat events, or alternatively extreme cold events, there's our ability to manage the business as usual day-to-day service delivery if flooding events become a more regular occurrence. So those two storm events that we had, most recently Babette and Henk, required almost full organisational responses in some cases. So you're talking about protecting, vulnerable elderly and children, keeping the highway network open, supporting broader groups of the community who've been impacted by it, as well as managing the after effects as well. So it's not just a one service impact, and I think that's why as CLT we thought it was a really important thing to reflect on here, and it will be here forevermore because that will be constantly changing, I think. So I think it's just set that marker that this is a regular thing that which will grow, and we'll try and expand our response to in terms of things like controls and what have you.
The point's being made about managing the risk of extreme weather events, and you tried to explain, I think, what we mean by, to a certain extent, that. But I think part of, having it on the risk register is to understand quite clearly what the definition of an extreme weather event is, as opposed to just a bad weather event or whatever, where maybe it takes time, a slight amount of time to actually deal with the issue, rather than it becoming vitally important that it's dealt with immediately. Because at some stage, presumably, we might well manage the extreme weather events quite adequately, and then we've got to work out, whether we take that risk any further.
I think that's a fair challenge, and I think there's the purpose of debates like this is around refining it, making sure that we get the pitch right, but we can take that away and feed that back into the next iteration. Thank you.
Just following on from what Mark said, Andrew, obviously this is managing the Section 19 flooding issues. Everything is really down to investigating what went wrong after the event. In terms of drainage management, flood management, obviously we have the flood management committee as well, but that is, that hinges very greatly on the people that deliver those drainage services, either the internal drainage boards and the Environment Agency, and further up the chain the landowners, of course, but the big players are the drainage boards and the Environment Agency, and we're probably acknowledging this risk now, but looking back in history, we've had the risks before. We've had some pretty catastrophic events. If you go back to 1953 flooding, we virtually had a tsunami came down the North Sea. 1963 we had the terrible winter. 1947 an appalling winter. So these are not. We may be more. We may feel that they're more current, but they're not unknown. We have had worse events than we've had of late. But I think we've got to say is the delivery of the solutions are very long term, and they involve a number of partners. And as Mark said, the devil is in the detail, and actually defining what you mean by extreme weather event. Obviously, I think we need to sort of consider that quite carefully, because otherwise, I think people would rightly see us as saying we could actually mitigate those risks, you know, substantially. Where in event we can mitigate the consequences, but we can't stop the reasons for those, whatever they happen to be. So I think we've got to be a little bit realistic on that one, as I say, because that, you know, if you look back over the last 50 years, there's been plenty of extreme weather events, and some of them for Lincolnshire have been pretty catastrophic. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just come back briefly on that. And then part of the debate we had at CLT was, and a good example of another one that you've got no control of is the inflation one. You know, you react to it accordingly, don't you? And I think there's various different levels of response that could come to answering this one. In its most simple form, on the extreme weather risk one, I'd be looking at, you know, as the corporate business continuity lead, I'd be making sure that our business continuity plans are all, you know, how do they respond to flooding, for example, or how do they extend to the extreme heat event or whatever that, like we had a couple of years ago, making sure that in the basic sense we've got some adequate controls around there. So it's not about us, you know, controlling the weather, but it's about how we respond and how we can ensure that business as usual service delivery can be upheld, and, you know, we're not sucking vast amounts of resource out of individual service areas if there is a crisis to deal with, if that makes sense. So, but definitely one to build on, as I say.
Andrew, in a more detailed matter as well, looking how we respond to our residents' concerns about that when the thing actually happens. Because I think anecdotally, a few members would say that where some communities felt that they were, you know, they were floundering to know where to go at a certain point. I mean, bearing in mind our resources were overstretched in terms of fire and rescue and those sort of things. But the old saying comes to mind, you know, stitch in time saves 9, doesn't it? And I think we've been neglecting our stitching over a number of years from actually looking at our infrastructure, and that it's going to take a while to solve. But that's my personal opinion, of course. Sorry, and I take your point, Andrew, on the inflation one, because that could rear its ugly head at another juncture as well, depending again on world events, which we've got no control over very much at all. So I was interested to hear Kevin's comments and about the restriction, you know, in market supply issues on children's services now as opposed to adults. And we've had lots of discussions over adult care market supply for a long time. Children's ones again is very important to us as well. So that's something I think we need to keep a watching brief on, and also looking at, I know on the market supply for adult social care, looking at how that market is going to change over years in terms of who are providing that care as well. I think you have a large number of smaller providers might maybe give you some more resilience than a lot of a small number of large providers, as we've just discussed in terms of auditing and those sort of things. But you know, then you have to provide the service as well. So thank you. Any further questions, members? No? Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Mandy. So if we can then move to recommendation, which is that we look at the current status of the strategic risks, and that the committee notes the objectives achieved this year and those planned for the future. And we've made recommendations accordingly. So do I have a proposer and seconder? Thank you. Thank you. All those in favour? Thank you. Okay, thank you for that, everyone. So if we can move on to item 8, which is the counter fraud report. Mark, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This is the first time that I am reporting to the committee, and I welcome this opportunity and thank you for that.
Thank you.
The report that I'm going to talk about is obviously a review of what counter fraud have done in the last 12 months. So some key areas for me relating to the role of counter fraud is that we delivered a successful week of delivering information to colleagues during National Fraud Week, and we also delivered in January 2 very successful briefing sessions to all staff, that was open to all staff, And probably what was encouraging at the end of that was an uplift in staff going and completing online training. And that was larger numbers than we'd seen previously, but probably it would be encouraging if we could have some more, and I think that would probably be delivered. Unfortunately, our training isn't mandatory. Maybe if it was mandatory, we might see a better uprise. However, it was still very encouraging. In relation to investigation management, we've had 18 referrals this year, and that has resulted in a total of 10 investigations, 4 of which are currently live. The ability to deliver the investigations in a timely manner has probably been enhanced by the fact we've had an uplift in staff, and we're now fully staffed, and that has been, or has allowed us to be able to deliver those in a timely fashion. It's also enabled us to be proactive in going out and conducting reviews, and those reviews have also managed to feed intelligence, which is we've also been able to utilise in our plan going forward for next year. Collaboration and engagement with both staff and external and internal partners is very important. By delivering those staff briefings, we've also been able to reach out to some of our colleagues, but we're also working both nationally with central government, regionally with a collaboration in relation to other counter-fraud teams across other councils. Internally, we've set up a counter-fraud representative group, and we also work with a multi-agency group locally to Lincolnshire, which is led by law enforcement. As a result of those, we're able to identify trends, gain intelligence, which we can then pass on to both our colleagues, and then that can also formulate the way that we can deliver our service. We also work with the NFI, and as you can see within the report are some figures that pertain to some of the work that we've done in relation to the recoveries. We've also carried out work in relation to the fraud risk, and again that can be seen in the report that will follow later. And again, moving forward, I think probably education to assist us. As I said, we are doing some work with central government, which is the Public Sector Fraud Authority. We're hoping that we can become members of that organisation, and we are aligning ourselves with them in order to improve our efficiency and update the quality of our delivery. Those for me are the highlights moving forward, and if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to take them.
Thank you, Mark.
Sorry, well, there's not many of us to ask questions, so I suppose that might be the case. The counter-fraud work, I think, is quite important in terms of a lot of it's associated with preventing fraud happening in the future, I suppose. So I do see it as important in that respect. Is there enough knowledge of counter-fraud work within the organisation as a whole for that prevention to be understood by everybody? In other words, you know, that we do take fraud seriously and we will take action if we see it.
Yes, absolutely. We deliver a communications plan throughout the year where we'll deliver that information to staff and how to report. We obviously have the confidential reporting mechanism, which is also used. So yes, we do have processes in place.
I've got a further question as well. There's some figures in the report about, I think, £17,100 worth of fraud actually appearing, should we say, in the various reports. Not necessarily that we've actually got that back in its entirety, I don't think. But what is the actual full figure that comes into view on an annual basis, if that's the one that actually sort of appears after a pseudo prosecution or whatever.
Okay, thank you. That figure relates to a saving that we have made in relation to the investigations that we conducted. So that figure is based on the information that we've gained from investigations. So in relation to any expenses, whether that would be mileage related, that the investigation has identified, and these are savings that we have as a result of being proactive within the investigation, have ultimately saved the council had we not have dealt with the issue.
I understand now. And it's similar for some of the other figures that you quote, you know, like the blue badge frauds and so on. It's a notional figure in terms of dealing with the issue.
That's correct. That's actually set by government, and that would relate to the figures that a blue badge would potentially cost if you were to actually pay for parking. So yes.
Ian.
Yeah, it was just to basically say we've had conversations around this, and actually I think some of the metrics we were discussing, there's physical cash recovery, prevention, capture, and then there's cash prevention effectively. And I think is what we're always going to have with the work is the if you do it well, the latter number is a lot bigger than the first one because you prevent rather than cure. But it's at the point of saying having sensible measures to say, is it having an impact we expect? So there's going to be a lot of proxies, but I know the team are working on this, and I think it's a journey. I know we've talked about it a lot. Is the journey? It's about being able to demonstrate how much that's improving over time.
Thank you, Ian. Andrew.
Well, following Councillor Allen's point about publicity and communication, etc., and linking it to the biggest incidents, which is blue badges and abuse of those. I've got a blue badge in my car, hangover from my sister-in-law who had a stroke and I was carrying about. I've never ever been tempted to use it because it would be illegal. I would expect censure, etc. So what in your view is the most powerful communication or publicity that will prevent people even thinking of defrauding?
I mean, I think that's probably a message that national government needs to probably put out in relation to how, when the returns of blue badges are required to be sent back. But again, there is the one scheme through the registrars where if somebody is deceased, then that is a way of notifying us as to how the badges could be returned. If it's somebody that has generally moved away from our area and then have perhaps re-registered somewhere else and just haven't sent ours back, even though it's within the timescales, then again, I think it's probably a national campaign really that probably needs to highlight that. Internally, yes, we can do it, but it's reaching out to the public and offering ways and means of them to be able to return those badges to us.
And changing subject to payroll fraud, which is, you know, paid claims and expenses is another high candidate, isn't it? Is local newspaper and radio publicity of what happened to Mr. X who did it, is that powerful?
I think probably more powerful would be doing it internally to communicate with staff, because prevention is always better than detection. And the best way, certainly for me, for prevention within is to provide communication internally.
Thank you, Andrew. Any further questions?
Unfortunately, Chairman, my question relates to Appendix B, which is not in the public domain, so I will email that question over to the relevant officer to save time.
A question from myself, Richard. Obviously, we're looking here with no court procedures ongoing at the moment. But looking forward, do we think that, obviously, as you've quite rightly said, you know, the deterrent factor is where we want to be rather than taking it to the next level. But in terms of the delays and everything in the court system at the moment, and sort of police investigations and everything, do you think that may be an issue we might have to deal with if we did have to go down that route at some stage?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. In relation to that, I think it's all about building up our relationships with both the police and the CPS. And I'd like to think with the ongoing work that we're doing within the groups that we're active in, is hopefully we can, if there is something that would get to that level, that we can have a good discussion and gain the support from our colleagues within law enforcement, that if we are requiring to take anything along those lines, then we can.
That's really good to know then, Mark, thank you. Okay, so we have the recommendations on the report. So do I have a proposer and seconder for those that we note the counter fraud work and discuss the annual fraud risk report?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. All those in favour? Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We move on to item 9, which is the counter fraud plan. Please.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Over the last 4 to 5 months, the team has worked along with our colleagues and all the directorates to formulate and develop our counter-fraud risk register and the plan that goes with that. In order to feed into the register, we have obtained various items of information, whether that be from previous audits conducted, previous intelligence obtained from previous investigations, from some of the forums and sectors, the public sector groups that we sit on, and engaging with our colleagues through interviews and obtaining any information or reports from third parties, governing bodies in relation to that. We've conducted the interviews and as a result of those, then they have obviously highlighted the plan going forward for the work that we wish to carry out proactively next year in the areas that are all mentioned within the report. I'm happy to answer any questions in relation to that.
Thank you, Mark. Questions for Mark regarding this?
I'll ask one if you insist, Chairman. How do you measure success of the plans, particularly if you vary the plan that you're putting forward for the next year? In other words, how do you compare one year with the other year if you are changing preferences and requirements or status or something?
We obviously have to remain fluid, so that should anything become apparent later on, say in quarter 2, 3 or 4, we need to be able to respond to that, and I think that's important. Obviously, success to me would be able to deliver the plan, but if I have to come and sit in front of you next year and say, but we had to move things due to a new and developing risk, then that's something for me to come and explain to you. But for me, success would be the delivery of this plan.
Well, I'm sorry to pursue this, but yes, the success is delivery of the plan. I'm quite sure about that in its entirety. But how do you measure the success of the plan that you delivered?
Well, the success would be the fact that when we're looking at the controls that are in place within the relevant areas that we're looking at, if those controls are working, then that would be a success. If they aren't working, then the success for me would then be for us to be able to highlight that to our colleagues in those departments, to work with them collaboratively, to develop new controls, to ensure that then we put mitigation in place to actually resolve what those issues were. So that would also be a success to me. And probably finally would be an education piece in and around why we're asking them to do what we're asking them to do and the reasons behind that.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Mark. That's okay. Just a follow through, Mark, if that's okay. In terms of the, I noticed on your account for plan, you've got sort of looking at sundry accounts, etc. Obviously, Fords aren't always on the general controls around payroll, which you would do, presumably looking at exception reporting with that. I don't know what the accountancy system can deliver you with that, if, on some reports that might highlight some material changes that you might not expect. But on the sundry accounts, that, yeah, I note your comments there, because it's not always the, you know, if you wanted to commit, people want to commit a fraud, doing it regularly on small accounts that might not get noticed is probably a danger.
I think a lot of our work is going to be down to education and going to areas that perhaps we haven't visited in a period of time. And that is one of the areas that we feel that, you know, we could work collaboratively with our colleagues and enhance their current position in relation to their controls and their understandings. So that's a further opportunity for us to offer our assistance to those with the sundry accounts.
Thank you. So pending no further questions, can't see anybody's hands up. We have the recommendations from item 9, which is to review and approve the counter forward work plan for 24-25. Propose a seconder. Thank you. All those in favour? Thank you. Thank you for everyone. So we'll now move on to item 10, which is the internal audit plan for 24-25. And we now do ask Claire.
Thank you, Chairman. So this is a plan for 24-25, showing the audits that are planned for us to deliver and how resources will be deployed across the council. I can confirm that the team has sufficient resource to deliver this plan, and it will be sufficient to provide my audit opinion at the end of that financial year. I would politely ask the committee to review the plan and raise any questions with a view to approving the plan for 24-25.
Thank you, Claire. Any questions to Claire? I think we've made a few comments regarding training, but that'd be an ongoing thing, and I think we were looking a bit further than just the rest of this year. We have, perhaps, I don't know, are we doing anything specifically at some stage, Claire, on sort of looking at children's services and any emerging risks on market supply? And that's a more general question rather than the internal audit.
So that will fall into the quarterly risk work that the risk team do. And obviously, as that starts to develop, if that position changes, that's when we need that fluidity in the plan to pull something in. But at the moment, there isn't anything planned. There's quite a high level of assurance within the children's services, but that work will be continually monitored in the quarterly strategic risk work.
Adam.
Thank you, Chairman. So mine question relates to on page 224 where it says contingency. Obviously, I'm just wondering what the proportion is that it would be available if there was something that was so urgent that needed looking into, because obviously other things would still need to be done that's within the programme that you've got in front of us, but obviously having a contingency in there, I'm just wondering what proportion and what percentage that would be, just in case that you need to go in somewhere urgently.
So I think from memory, we're looking at about 20% of our contingent. If that isn't used for something that's emerging, that will be used then for follow-up reviews and some consultancy work that we've already been approached for, but that won't take precedent over the risk-based assurance work.
Thank you. Do we have any further questions for Claire? No? Thank you, Claire. So we have the recommendations on item 10. And do I have a proposer and seconder for those? Thank you. All those in favour? All three of us. And that's great, thank you. And then we can move on to item 11, which is our work plan. Thank you.
So this is the proposed work plan for the coming year. It includes a training programme for the year which covers areas of focus and learning that we've previously talked about. The revised plan also includes the 3 additional papers that you requested from the combined risk work in February, which is a paper on the fire risk and the 2 adults and community risk papers as well. There is inclusion of the training plan for the current committee, which covers what the key development areas are we'd like to discuss. But also we are working in the background with our finance colleagues in relation to a full training programme should the election result in changes to the committee, which will be more of an introductory based as opposed to, as we are as a committee, building on what we already know. I haven't included that in the plan because we don't know the timing of that, and we're working with finance colleagues to make sure we give you a full comprehensive background so that people have got the skills to deliver right from inception.
Thank you, Claire. That's reassuring. Thank you. Any further questions for Claire? No? So we have the paper for our recommendation. Proposer and seconder. All those agreeing? So thank you so much to everyone, and that I think concludes our meeting today. And we look forward to seeing everyone at the June meeting. Or the meeting before then, which is June, isn't it? Or is it May? I think it is. So this is the June one, which will have the training prior to it, as we've already discussed. Yeah. It is flying by.
Can I just ask, are we having a closed session on Mark's additional paper to give people
Yes, I
opportunity
think
to ask around
we should, yeah, because if we could do that, that'd be good. Yeah, if we could have a vote on, do I have the wording? Yeah. We don't have the wording, but if we can vote to close the session to look at the pink paper on the fraud items. Thank you.